Well, today we have a different take on what we're doing on the show, the Vegan Visibility Podcast Show. I'm Kathleen Gage. I'm your host, and I am privileged to be talking with Omaid Hiwaizi, who is with ReFarm Fund. And the whole vision behind ReFarm Fund is to change farming forever. And with that, Omaid, it is great to have you here.
Welcome to the Vegan Visibility Podcast Show, where your host, Kathleen Gage, shines the spotlight on vegan and plant-based businesses and entrepreneurs from all walks of life committed to cruelty-free eating, healthy lifestyles, animal compassion, and the environment. Enjoy the show.
Thanks for having me on, Kathleen. It's a real pleasure to talk to you and talk about this project, which we're very, very excited about.
Well, I love what you're doing because you're rethinking the way farming is done. Right now, it's a lot about animal agriculture, and your whole goal with the ReFarm Fund is that we do away with factory farming, we do away with animal farming, and move into more sustainable plant-based farming. So let's talk about what the vision for ReFarm Fund is and when it started and where you see things going.
Great. I mean, so I should explain that I'm obviously an ethical vegan, and I'm involved in some activism in the UK, let's say, and but I'm also involved in technology and startups and scale-ups, fintech, and I'm really, really interested in the application of tech and new business models to drive change. So if you take my interest in, let's say, animal justice and my, let's say, professional experience, I was looking for something that blended the two, where the two could, some change could be practically achieved. I wondered about the, you read a couple of years ago, there were a lot of headlines about farming, farmers not doing very well commercially. Lots and lots of farmers having to close their holding, their smaller farms because of various reasons, and actually the more successful farms are the horrible big industrial factory farms. I mean, it seemed to be that's the only way you could make money as a farmer. It was also the case that I came across a load of statistics to do with the environmental impact of animal farming globally. The enormous greenhouse gas footprint. It's really, really significant on a global scale. What it comes down to is not only what comes out of the animals, but also all of the effort required to grow what you feed them. And this kind of ridiculous comment that comes from people who are on, let's say, on the other side about the rainforests in South America being cut down to grow soybeans. Well, the reality is the soybeans don't become soy milk, they become fodder for beef cattle. 80-90% of them do. So, some of these things came into view, and it dawned on me that there might be a better way. And I commissioned some land economists, some experienced kind of farmer economists in the UK to do me a study where on one side of the equation there was, it came down to a spreadsheet in the end. If you have a farm of a certain size and it's entirely committed to, say, cattle, what are the costs? What are the input costs? What are the labor costs? And then once you process the product, let's say, and sell it, what do you get? And what are all the government subsidies and so on? So there was like a return on capital calculation. They also did that for intense arable and dairy. And then I asked them to do the same thing for rotation-based arable, tree planting, and then mixtures thereof. And this was the light bulb moment, because in all the scenarios, the return on capital was higher once you transitioned away from animal farming and intensive farming. And the point about it is that the total output may be less, but actually the inputs are so much less. So fertilizers, obviously petrochemical-based fertilizers, weed killers, and so on, and labor costs, because when you have those things, you also need to pay people to put them on. Were so less that actually the return on capital was higher. And I thought there's something in this, right, where these transitions, you potentially could make a an environmental and commercial argument, and almost like take the animals off the table. And then I realized that, if I was able to, let's say, talk about it in the right way, let's put it that way, then it ends up being a kind of a good commercial decision. Put it this way, the only way that I can see that animal farming can become net zero is to remove the animals. Well, I would say, put it this way, significantly reduce or remove the animals. Let me be completely honest. Yeah, like down to a very small percentage of what they have, or not at all. And so that was the instigation of the piece. And the question was how to do this. Like, what is the product? How are we going to make this happen? Because I'm not a farmer. As I described, I'm like a tech marketer, and doing fintech and stuff like that. So I kind of started to build a team of folks in that area, people who understood regulation and people who understood farming and so on. And then we realized that, and off the back of some additional research we did, that actually while farmers are generally kind of, love the land, they love what they do, they're very traditional, they like, they feel they're in a kind of a respectful relationship with their farms, to be honest, including the animals who we would have a different view on that, but that's how they feel. That's their truth. And so but we realized that actually they are interested in many of them are interested in trying different things, and the barriers were knowledge, finance, managing the risk of changing, and so on. So we were looking at different ways of interacting with the farmers, and we realized originally we were talking about equity, actually kind of buying land, buying part of their land, and so on. There are some massive regulatory hurdles to the structures you have to set up, the regulated fund structures you have to set up to do that. So actually what we've done is push that into the future and realize that in the short to medium term, what we can do is supply them capital, like loan capital.
Right.
And the product that we're developing now is effectively, it's a loan product attached to a transition. So if the farmer wants to make some kind of particular transition from our various options, the core of which are a transition to regenerative agriculture, so rotation-based traditional agriculture with minimum or no inputs, and broadly speaking, rotation, a rotation-based crop rotation on that, and producing arable, which ends up becoming significantly less carbon impact, or in fact sequesters carbon, or other projects which are relevant, which are to do with the use of renewable energy and other kinds of, let's say, efficiency based structures. So the implementation of polytunnels, not windmills, right. Large glass houses, but where the energy comes from renewable sources, which are projects which are also implemented on the farm. So we're developing a selection of, let's say, projects like that. And then the idea is we will arrange the loan capital for that to happen. We'll provide experts who help the farmer with the transition and actually monitor it happening. And as it happens, we will, they'll have a loan, which will be a commercial loan, which they'll need to pay down. But actually, the fact that we'll be able to quantify the environmental impact, so the carbon sequestration and the biodiversity credits, let's say in the UK, you can get paid to increase biodiversity. So the point about that is that would accrue an amount of money which would reduce the loan payments.
Well, I'm curious because it really does come down to dollars and cents for a lot of people. I know that in the U.S., it is about the profit, especially for the corporations and the large factory farms. And we also in the U.S., with the research I've done, the larger corporations have really locked in the smaller farmers. So with what you're doing, is it only UK based, or do you have plans to expand globally on that?
No, it would be global, but yes, we're starting in the UK because to be honest with you, it's on our doorstep,
Right.
and it's simpler to understand. Now, the step there's various things that I'll share with you, but the most important one is the step that we're taking now, which is we're conducting our own medium to large scale study to assess the environmental and economic impact of these transitions, and it's being done by some folks at Cambridge University, and we're a third of the way through the project, and the impact. Well, so when that's done, we will have, let's say, a kind of a credible assessment of if this kind of farming situation changes to this kind of farming situation over this period of time. What are the finances and environmental impacts, so that when we're working with other farmers in the future, we've got some baselines to measure against. Now, once we've done enough of that, and then actually that's when we can be confident about these. Let's say the risk of the loans, which will be brokering with lenders, but then also the expected growth of the positive, let's say the commercial. That's what right word for it, but the expected environmental impact and the commercial value of that to offset the loan. And the issue with global is that those numbers are different in different scenarios. So the model is potentially repeatable and variations thereof, but we're baselining it in the UK now because that's where we are, basically.
Well, I'm curious because, I love what you're doing, and I love the vision, and I love that you're an ethical vegan. And that's one reason you're on the show, because I only have vegans and people who are completely void of animal and dairy on the show. And to wrap that around a movement, if you will, how does that align with people's demand, supply and demand for meat? Because there's a lot of people, every time I go to the grocery store, I'm shocked at how much meat is being consumed and bought. And what are your plans to educate the public around the need to minimize their animal food intake and to really move more towards a sustainable model? Because I saw something recently on one of our news shows. It was 60 Minutes or 2020, and they were talking about with the just the supply and demand that most people are not willing to make that change, that the fast food restaurants are on the increase. What is your plan for educating the public around that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The ReFarm Fund, I don't think will educate the public around that. And the reason I say that is because I think that there are activist groups bringing the conversation up, and then there are other groups who are looking at education. So in the UK, there's a number of groups who are helping people kind of adopt plant-based options, let's say, use that word, and not necessarily talk about the ethical issues around it, and then leading them on that journey. What we're looking to do is effectively the supply side, shifting the supply side. And obviously something that would be huge, well, several things, these are things I was alluding to earlier, that are going to be huge for this area. One is as net zero requirements, governments start to kind of take them seriously, as they increasingly are. Let's say the whole impact of any food or any product will have to be factored into its cost, and that may be through taxation. So in the US, I don't know if you have this, but in the UK, certain sodas that have sugar in have what's called a sugar tax. They cost more.
Interesting.
And that's because they end up costing the National Health Service more, in diabetes, type 2 diabetes treatment down the line, and dentists as well, and it's very early days, but I think that, the discussion around, let's say, a meat tax or a red meat tax based on the environmental impact of the, the way that stuff is made, would affect things, because actually people don't pay the actual cost now, because certainly in the UK, farm subsidies are hugely focused towards those kinds of farms more than arable farms. And so I think those things will shift, which will start to drive the change. And then obviously if you're looking at the market dynamics, as the price of, that stuff goes up, then people will start to have it on special occasions only, and then the change will start to people get used to doing other things and so on. What we're looking to do is put it this way, with net zero, and this is what I find fascinating in my commercial work, is when you start to look in the way systems work, you start to see mechanisms that aren't immediately obvious from the outside. So one thing that I'm quite interested in is the growth of corporate companies adopting environmental the sustainability goals. You know, those where corporations are having policies about their environmental, social impact and so on. And that's not because they thought they woke up one morning and thought we should be good guys now. What it is generally pension funds where large numbers of the individuals investing into them have said, I'd like this to be an ethical investment. So when they turn up at the annual meeting with their 2%, 5% of a corporation, they say, where's the ethical policy? And so that's driven corporations, starting to do, let's say, greenwash ethical policy, and then actually real ethical policy. Now, I think what's happening that I'm aware of through our partners in the ecosystem as we develop our business is that the banks that bank farmers are adopting net zero policies, and by a certain time, their business customers will have to be net zero. And
explain, if you would, what net zero means for those people who have not heard that term before. What exactly is net zero?
All right. So in terms of the entirety of an operation of a business or some kind of project, while some parts of the business will generate carbon dioxide and emit it into the atmosphere, others will absorb it. And so the total impact of that operation from an carbon dioxide point of view is zero. Quite a lot of the time, corporations outsource their carbon capture, so that's when they buy carbon credits, so other people can make a commercial benefit from from capturing and holding carbon in different ways in the ground generally, and in fact farmers can do that in that farmers who switch to sequestering carbon using their regenerative techniques or whatever can actually commercialize that, and that's part of what ReFarm Fund does. But in broad terms, this is the way governments are moving, and then the large corporations are adopting it, and then they're adopting this. They're requiring their customers and so on to do the same.
Right.
And my point is that many farms are banked by banks who are adopting net zero requirements of their customers. So the farmers are going to need to do this somehow, and so actually there's a mechanism happening where farmers who are hugely carbon emitting are going to have to either pay someone to sequester carbon on their behalf or change their farming so that they can actually be banked, because they won't be able to carry on. They won't be able to carry on in their business without being without kind of, let's say, mitigating their carbon impact.
Well, and let's really look at the whole, the truth behind the carbon impact. Where are we right now? Because, some people seem to think that we still have, 100 years, and other people are saying, no, we have 3 or 4 years and that's it before it's all, we can look at the weather patterns, we can look at the stripping away of the rainforest, we can look at people's health, and which all of that is just exploding. Where are we as far as the amount of time that we have to make these changes, and dramatic changes at that? And, how do people differentiate between what is fact and what is fiction?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's highly politicized.
Yes.
I would say I'm not an environmental scientist, but what I will say is this, that I live in Europe, and increasingly, let's say the Garden of Europe, which is the kind of Mediterranean countries, have too little water and too much heat, and their crop yields are failing. They failed last year, and they're going to continue to have problems. The big the big indicator to me is that in my discussions with the ReFarm Fund on some folks in the Nordics, so the north of Europe, colder countries, farmland prices are going up in those countries. And why? Because there's an expectation that those countries are going to become the Garden of Europe. general climate heating in the Mediterranean. The market is thinking that actually those countries are not going to be able to yield the food that they do now.
Right.
And what are currently colder countries are going to become countries that do huge amounts of food production, because that's the change. And when I see things like that, I don't need to look at the argy-bargy in the news. I can just see it's happening, and
right.
And we need to do something about it. If land prices are going up, then that's a very, very clear indicator that people are expecting that that land is going to become more and more important going forwards. For what it's worth, I think we're kind of tens of years away from serious issues. And the kinds of catastrophes that might happen is when certain countries near the equator start to not be sustainable from a food or water point of view, and there are huge movements. I don't know how they would affect other parts of the world, but certainly the kind of European and African landmass, that I would expect huge amounts of people to be moving north, which means Northern Europe, Britain, and so on. Because they potentially won't be able to feed themselves. I mean, in Britain, the general population has been, let's say, kind of bumped forward a little bit, because last summer, we had a burning summer in Britain, painful, and people who maybe were cynical, thinking, really, I don't remember it ever being this hot, not for 40, 50 years. We'll see if it happens again this summer. I reckon, certainly the population here, I think, we need to do something,
Right. Well, we're seeing that in the U.S. We're seeing areas that are being flooded over and over again. We had mass fires for quite a few years now. The heat waves that are happening, and unfortunately, it's usually the lower income and the elderly that are suffering the most. And to get people to understand, we have to take action now. And I want to take a step back. And you mentioned that you're an ethical vegan. How long have you been vegan? And what was your the catalyst for you deciding to be vegan?
Yeah, so interesting. So I'm 53, and I became vegan when I was 24.
Mm-hmm.
And what it was, I was already vegetarian. So as a teenager, I'd rejected meat for whatever teenage reasons, just didn't like it. And I thought that it was entirely a good thing to do, to be a vegetarian. And then I discovered what happened to calves in dairy. And in particular in this country, the male calves are exported live to Europe, where they're kept in small crates. They're veal crates. I don't know if you have that in the US. And the reason they do it they were exporting them to Europe live is because it's illegal to do in the UK. So they were exporting them so that they could do it there, and then they'd kill them and bring them back, this white meat called veal, and they don't want the calves to move. So that's why they keep them in crates. And then I thought, no, not in my name. So that was the trigger point. And actually, I to be honest, for many years, I was never that active, let's say, and my kids as they got into their teens and 20s, all dabbled with different kinds of vegan activism, and to be frank, I've kind of got sucked in behind them a little bit.
So are all your kids vegan?
Yeah.
Wow, that's quite an accomplishment. But and it's interesting, because I believe that we all have our own way of being activists. For example, I do it through my podcast show, through my writing, and featuring people like yourself. And what would be your message to people who are just so resistant to change? They're like, well, I like my hamburger, I like my bacon, and whenever I hear that, it drives me crazy. And I just want to say, do you realize what you're doing? And I oftentimes have. I was talking to somebody recently, and they were choosing between vegan mayonnaise and regular mayonnaise, and I said, well, the vegan choice is actually more compassionate. And the response was, well, I have to worry about calories. And I thought, it's like, let's go beyond that. So how do we educate people on the the pain and suffering the animals go through, the pain and suffering the earth is going through, the pain and suffering people are going through with their health. What would be your one takeaway for people to get them to at least be more open to things like what you're doing with the ReFarm Fund and the movement that you're a part of?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't have a simple answer. What I'll say is that unfortunately, most people don't care about animals. I mean, they're people were brought up to think that they're objects in farms,
Right.
and we can have cuddly toys of them for our in our houses, but actually, we
Right.
don't think about their real lives. And I think that change for some people is too big, if I'm honest. I focus myself on people who are open-minded, who can, and actually I think that you get people whose identity, this is my view, you get people whose identity in many ways is tied into their traditions and habits.
Right.
And actually you'll see this in other dimensions of those folks, that they'll think they've lost who they are if they change anything. And I would argue that actually we're not going to change everyone overnight. So let's focus on the ones who are more open-minded, and that tends to skew to younger people. But I think that older people having an epiphany to do with their place in the world and so on doesn't happen very often. It does happen. It's quite notable when it does. But actually, younger people are more likely to adopt those things. The reason why I think that some of these market forces, which you're alluding to earlier, and including, and climate impact, may be on our side, is on our side, is that if people don't care about animals, then they care about themselves. And
Right,
so when
right.
they start to see the world's changing and with a negative impact to themselves and their family, then they start to be a little bit open-minded. And then the question is, what's the route through that? There's an activist group in the UK who used to be called Animal Rebellion. They're now called Animal Rising, and they're starting to do some actions to do with horse racing, and other things like that. And broadly, what the strategy seems to be that bring to attention the suffering of animals you care about. So people
Right.
in the UK like horses, they like dogs, and so on. And if people start to kind of really connect with the suffering of those animals, then in my mind, that's a start point of them kind of extending to other animals.
Absolutely.
But it's a process. If I'm honest, I don't think it's possible to do overnight.
I agree with you. I'm 100% agreement. And we can live in our own little bubble in the world, and then when we go out into the real world, if you will, and we see what's going on, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much work to be done. And I want to remind people, you're listening to the Vegan Visibility Podcast Show. I'm Kathleen Gage. I'm your host, and I'm talking with Omaid Hiwaizi, who is with ReFarm Fund. And Omaid, how do people reach you? What's the easiest way for them to get more information on what you're doing?
So just come to refarm.fund. We've got a website with a contact form, or email me, omaid@refarm.fund, and we can pick things up. I'm very, broadly speaking, we're looking for partnerships or let's say collaboration with people who understand regenerative farming, renewable energy projects, and then also the particularly if you're UK based, people with experience of the financial markets. So our interface with between us as a loan broker and the loan providers. Well, having said that, we are having conversations with those folks.
Wonderful.
But we're anyone with those interests who'd like to get on board. For me, this is obviously I do projects, and I do them to make money. This isn't a money project for me. This is if we get it to go, it's an extremely effective Trojan horse, let's say, to achieve what we all want.
Okay. Okay. Well, in closing, Omaid, what are your final thoughts for people? What would you like to leave them with so that they can at least consider doing their farming a different way? And when they go to the grocery, that they actually look at what they're purchasing and realize that there is a whole process that happens to get that food on their plate and first in their cart and then on their plate. And it doesn't just magically drop from the heavens. And so what are your final thoughts for people?
Yeah, I mean, let me think. You know, like any person who's connected in the world, I think we have choices, and those choices have negative and positive repercussions. And no one's perfect, but actually, I'd say to everyone, just make one more positive choice a week as you go, and see how that feels. If that means adopting food that is plant-based, and then you realize that actually what you're doing is helping animals, helping the environment, and actually helping your own health, then that's a good thing. You'll feel better, and it's something to pursue. If you're already committed to those things, what I would say is that, if you're already a vegan and you're very active about it, what I'd say is just try and find the connections with folks who aren't, rather than arguing with them. If you can find some common grounds, and even if you kind of have to, let's say, tone down what you say a little bit,
right,
then you're more likely to bring people along with you. But do remember, there are folks who will never change. So if you have an argument with someone who will never change and they don't change, don't be demoralized because they were never going to change. You just wasted your time,
Well,
and
it's
move on.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because I had somebody I was having a conversation with the other day, and I was 64 when I went vegan, and it's been nearly 5 years. And they said, okay, so you think people should quit eating meat and they should do this, that, and the other. How old were you when you went vegan? And I'm like, oh, shoot, they got me. 64, that's pretty late in life to make this kind of change. And you did it when you were, if I'm not mistaken, in your 20s or 30s.
Yeah, 24. Yeah.
24. So, it's something that we have to have empathy for other people and understand that it takes what it takes. And Omaid, I'm so thrilled to have had you on the show. I wish you the best of luck. And I encourage people, check out your website at ReFarm.Fund. That's ReFarm.Fund, and see what they're doing. So, Omaid, thank you so much for being on the show. And I wish you much success in your endeavors.
Thanks, Kathleen. All the best. See you again. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
You've been listening to the Vegan Visibility Podcast Show. Be sure to subscribe to get notified when the next episode is live. And we always appreciate reviews. Join us next time for more inspiration, education, and motivation to build your business one cruelty-free and healthy person at a time.